give you a very brief insight on a slightly more practical level about how we at Elsevier as a publisher deal with basically two key topics. One is how do we as publishers address quality assurance before publication, and then secondly, if malpractice does come to light once the paper is published, how exactly what is our role in that process? And then right at the end I'll just have 2 slides about some of the common dilemmas that we're facing, and also finally just on the reproducibility aspect. So, just moving on, clearly as a publisher the first thing we had to do was try and, we have done, is really frame this in 2 ways in terms of the fundamentals. What is our role here fundamentally in the research process? And essentially what we've come up with is to say that we are there to safeguard the quality and integrity of the content we publish. Obvious, very obvious, but nevertheless a very fundamental thing to state. And then the next thing is, well, how do we do that? And really it's all about prevention, and it's about educating authors but also would-be authors in terms of the kinds of ethical practices that they should be adopting in their research even before they come to write the paper. And I should say at this point that it has to be a very collaborative approach all the way through. We are working constantly with institutions, with funders, with our journal editors to do this. And just as one small example, a couple of weeks ago, I was at the University of Bristol, and in fact, one of the pro-VCs, who's the chair of the ethics committee, we were looking at each other's policies. So we were looking at the institutional ethics policy and how they advise researchers and comparing that to what we're doing within Elsevier in terms of publishing journals. And it's an ever-moving feast. And lastly, we have a function to help and support our editors in terms of both tools, services and guidelines to make it very clear what the best practice is and what we should be undertaking. And then taking those fundamentals, we've also translated those into 3 principles under which we operate. The first one is obviously to be very fair and transparent, and to listen very carefully to all sides of the debate, to make sure that we're not casting judgment quickly, to make sure that everything is thoughtfully considered. And a couple of examples there, which I think is probably true, resonates with the audience, is in terms of retractions. We're now looking at retractions of retractions in terms of retraction of a paper can sometimes be too broad, and in fact what we're dealing with is possibly a problem within the paper to do with one of the data articles, one of the figures or half-tones or whatever, and I'll talk about that in a minute. But the other thing is it's also about a balanced approach and making sure that we don't put barriers to submission. So it's basically about a proportionate response, and making sure that for authors we're not making it so burdensome because of the misconduct, if you like, of less than 1%. And I think it's important to size it in that way and make sure that not everybody is being tarnished with the same brush. And lastly, as I've said, the collaboration, and obviously we collaborate with COPE. All our editors have access to COPE and other various committees that we work with. So, drilling down a little bit, what exactly do we do to help our authors? Clearly, we have to have a core ethical policy in all our journals, all our guides for authors. And actually, that's quite a problem when you're as big as we are, because we have over 2,000 journals, we respect editorial independence, and it's very important, and various editors have their own perspective about exactly what should be included in those guides. But fundamentally, that's what we work constantly with our editors. And indeed, every time a case comes up, an ethics case, we will examine that guide for authors and update it where we see fit. We also, as well, have policies around animal testing, and as you've already alluded to, it can vary from country to country, and we try, because of our size, to engage with external stakeholders, so NIH, etc., when they're looking at various ways of improving best practice. And we also ask our authors, in terms of mandatory ethics statements, that they have to actually adhere to. One of the things we're looking at the moment, though, is trying to make it not quite so accusatory, and we're looking at some of the language that we're using in those statements so editors don't feel so much under siege, as it were. So just moving on a little bit to the editor area. As I said at the start, we have various tools, we have processes, and we have advice. We handle a huge number of papers, as I'm sure you realise, 1.2 million submissions a year, of which we probably accept about 2/3, so it's about 66%. And clearly we are trying to use as many tools as we can and provide those to our editors, so obviously CrossCheck and all the various plagiarism tools. But we also recognise that those tools are never perfect. And actually you still rely on the expertise of the editor, who sometimes has to adjudicate, and obviously these cases are not always clear-cut. So we still respect and recognise and support editors in having to examine some of the cases in detail. And we also always give authors the right to respond. And we actually take that process in a fairly measured way to make sure that everybody has time to consider the responses and have a dialogue about that before we would take another step, if you like, in accusing the author of malpractice. And finally, we too are looking at tools to investigate how data fraud, data enhancement, but of course everybody knows that it's very slow progress in terms of technical tools, and a lot of it is still manual. We do have an experiment actually at Cell Press, which is called Figure Forensic, where we are looking at data objects, figures and halftones. At the moment we haven't actually overtly discovered fraud, but we have gone back to authors on quite a few papers and actually asked for extra information and also asked for other data sets. Okay, so just moving on here. So if you do discover or you suspect that some kind of malpractice has occurred on a paper, what do we do about it? How do we investigate? How do we resolve? And what is our role in that whole process? First of all, as I've said, we give the tools to the editors. How can they, because they are, ultimately we see them as the adjudicator, and we will say to our journal editors, if you have any concerns, even if you cannot prove that, it is your prerogative to reject that paper. So ultimately we will empower them and recommend that they take that role. We do have ethics experts, we have legal experts on hand, but also the publishers are handling an awful lot of journals, and we see these cases on every day, on a daily basis. So we can share with them other cases. We won't necessarily tell them what to do, but we can reference several cases and indeed send them to organisations like COPE, where they have a library of recent cases and some of their outcomes. We also do extensive training and advice, and in fact, well, both for editors but also for authors, and I would say that our ethics training is the most popular module. We do webinars, we do face-to-face, and we tend to do those also. We have a big programme for early career researchers where we go to institutes and we work with the research deans there, we work with the editors and also other organisations to deliver training to postgraduates, young researchers about the ethics of publication and about the ethics of research. And again, it's about implementing the most appropriate corrections as decided by the editor. So sometimes people may say it takes a while to come to a decision and to come to an action, but we think that it has to be very carefully reviewed and done in a measured way because it has huge impacts both for editors and authors if something goes wrong. And then, of course, there's the media attention. And again, we do clearly have a corporate relations group who will help editors navigate some of the pitfalls if things go to the media and if we feel the story's been misrepresented in any way. So just summarising, so this just summarises what's in the toolkit. It's all online. People don't have to attend training courses. We give step-by-step guides to our editors and authors. We also go through our policies in detail, and those are updated very regularly. We give them real-life cases as well and go through the outcomes and walk them through the outcomes, and of course also use COPE in a lot of those instances. And we also support them with form letters. How exactly do they frame some of the complaints? How do they actually engage in correspondence on some of these tricky legal issues? And of course we can again refer to previous literature and previous correspondence and the outcomes of that. And we also have detailed Q&A sessions when we run our workshops to allow editors to actually explore exactly the issues that they're experiencing on their journal and how we might help. And the good thing about those forums is quite often other editors are in the room and they can share experiences with each other across disciplines. So these are just some of the common dilemmas that come up, which I just thought might be worth sharing. I'm sure lots of these will resonate. What do you do when authors or institutes don't reply? So we ourselves, or we will encourage our editors clearly to report the facts to an institute, and quite often we won't get a timely response. Sometimes we may not necessarily have confidence in the objectivity of the institution's response. I mean, clearly they have a vested interest, and it's very difficult if you suspect it's not quite clear to actually, how do you respond to that? How do you challenge that? And what are the avenues? What are the processes in which you can do it? And what if the author isn't affiliated to an institute is another question. What if the raw data is no longer available? So I think we heard on the first day, researchers having data on their laptops and it just mysteriously vanishes. The other aspect here is authors having conflicting stories, and it's he said, she said, etc. How do you mediate those discussions and get to the truth, if you will, in those debates? And in cases of serious misconduct, we obviously have debates about, well, do we warn other editors? We've often have the question of, do we operate blacklists and these kinds of things? So it's very tricky to adjudicate in these environments without clear evidence. So a lot of the time there are accusations and it's very difficult to actually have proof, if you will. I can see Bern, you want to move on? I'll finish off very quickly. To actually have proof that something has happened, and that's really the dilemma that we actually come across. It's actually having hard evidence before you accuse somebody or indeed retract the paper. And then the final thing that I wanted to just cover about reproducibility, just a couple of ways that we're hoping to do it within Elsevier. Mendeley data, so basically we're hoping to give a more robust and sustainable way of authors being able to share and preserve data sets so it doesn't go astray. And also we're doing various initiatives actually industry-wide, so supporting clinical trials through linked trials, which is run by CrossRef, to try and get transparency and make sure that there's much more information in context around both successful clinical trials but also incomplete ones. And just a final note I wanted to make on author contributorship. We are actually doing quite a lot of that and have done for a number of years. If you take, for example, the Lancet, at the end of all papers, we do, in free text, actually specify the contribution of the authors. And we're also experimenting with the taxonomy that I think was referenced earlier in the conference, to look at ways that we can harvest in a consistent way the contributions that people make. But having said that, I think one of the things we feel very strongly about for the leading journals in international research is that there is a collective responsibility. So all the authors on a paper should be accountable. And if there has been any malpractice or misdemeanors, it's not really acceptable that people can walk away from that and claim that they didn't know. And what we do see, unfortunately, is hierarchy plays a role here, and it's usually the junior fellow or the postdoc who's blamed for some of the data integrity issues, should I say, that actually arise. Okay, so I just wanted to keep it brief. Hopefully that was helpful to people about how we take a view on these issues. Thank you very much.